Let's talk about T1-4, Temple of Elemental Evil by Gary Gygax with Frank Mentzer. The expanded and completed edition of Mike version is 1985 of the 1979 module T1 Village of Homlet by Gary Gygax. The story of the co-authorship there, so far as I've ever been able to see, is that the development of the next module, this is the first of two modules apparently, and the development of T2 was so lagging with Gary's both busyness and probably lack of motivation, being very distracted with other things, that eventually editor and key TSR figure at the time, Frank Mentzer, who also he wrote rules and he wrote modules as well. He completed it, but completed it in this case seems to be that there was a key, and Mentzer expanded that and made sure it was detailed from what the key was, made it make sense, and also added the supporting material, linking material between modules. This is different to the other infamous incident of this happening, Q1, Queen of the Demon Word Pits, which is Gary and Dave Sutherland, which it turns out seems to have been pretty much that Gary said, this is my idea, do what you want, and Sutherland wrote a module. This is a Gygax module finished by Mentzer. This is Tolkien finished by Tolkien, or perhaps Jordan finished by Sanderson. This is T1 is widely considered one of the great AD&D modules, and it's a really interesting module. It says it's introductory to novice level. This, by the way, this is a module or campaign I'm running at the moment. It's introductory to novice level, it says, and the village of Homlet is near some woodlands, and or in some woodlands, I think technically, and nearby is the ruined Temple of Elemental Evil, destroyed long ago, but darkness is rising. And I think this is seen as a really good starting village and setting. Really, it gives a very strong Greyhawk feel. We'll kind of get to that maybe, but then it also has an iconic dungeon, the Moat House. There are some differences between this T1 and the T1 equivalent here. Mostly pretty minor. I will pick up one important one, and there are a couple at that level, just as we look at the main book. Technically, this does say here, this adds T1, but here it's T1-4, and it is fundamentally that's been turned into 4 modules, albeit of exceptionally uneven length. So you have, in this edition, you have an introductory section of 6 pages. The Village of Homlet is 20 pages. There's then a kind of odd second introductory section for like 3 pages. Nulb and the Ruins, essentially, part 2, aka T2, is 13 pages. Part 3, Dungeons of Elemental Evil, is 64 pages. Pretty much, so therefore the longest module. If that's T3, that's the longest module released so far at this point for AD&D. And then Nodes of Elemental Evil Part 4 is 13 pages with an 8-page appendix, or 9-page appendix, I think, actually. So, yeah, and Nodes being therefore T4. And I think that I assume is the intention. You can see that those are very different lengths. You've got one very long one pretty normal lengthish one, 20 pages, and then two that are really only the comparable length of a couple of the Giants modules, 8 to 12 pages. Nothing else in first edition really runs that short. And here you can obviously see you go from a starting village with a starting dungeon to the main kind of I guess a bridging area, and then in fact that part 2 has the upper works of the Temple of Elemental Evil. Then you have the main dungeons, a 4-level dungeon, a mini mega dungeon with like 200 rooms or something like over that, I think, slightly. And then you have this other thing, this planar adventure, the Nodes of Elemental Evil, which does link back into the Dungeons of Elemental Evil. So yeah, just to briefly go back to T1, and then I'll kind of get into the module as a whole. Here you've got this iconic dungeon, you've got this great village, and it sets up this bigger campaign. And then as nothing comes out for years, it's very much a standalone there. Nothing else happens from there for a while, and then we get this at a point where they're wanting to just get Gary's content out. They're wanting to finish off some of the stuff. They're both scraping in a sense, scraping the barrel. You know, the EX series, not that they are interesting modules, but they're scraping the barrel in terms of just weird demi-planar stuff. WG8, Isle of the Ape, similarly. Mordenkainen's Fantastic Adventure, just weird stuff, just so they can get some content out there with Gygax's name on it. And Castle Greyhawk, of course, never comes out in any meaningful form, his actual mega dungeon. But here, this is his other kind of great dungeon campaign. This one is the one that is less that the dungeon is the campaign, the true mega dungeon, and it's more that the dungeon as the centerpiece of a campaign. It's a tentpole dungeon, not a complete campaign. And indeed, to be fair, even Castle Greyhawk only ever worked as a tentpole because you had parties going off here, and this involved, you know, the good guy PCs trying to do stuff for a while, then Sir Robbelaar turning up and causing chaos, and then the good guy PCs having to piece things back together. People like Otis and Day who turn up in this module, in fact. Robbelaar being Rob Kuntz's character. Very, very high Gygax. And you get some of that information in the book. It's not necessarily particularly valuable. It's interesting, but as a game product, not necessarily, because it's not really a description of how players do stuff. It's just a bit of fiction almost. It does come with a map booklet, so where T1 comes with a map. Well, you're kind of encouraged to cut it out. Mine came like the second-hand, a map sheet and a unphotocopyable village map. This comes with, you know, a bit slightly nice, higher tech. It's quite nice. It has a very good cover. There is some decent art, but it is pretty low on the art. And when I say decent, there's plenty of pieces in this, just to sum up the art situation. There's plenty of pieces at that kind of level. You know, we're not talking about, it's just some dungeon dressing. There are a few relevant pieces of art. There's for puzzles and for major areas. There are a few bits of character art and relevant setting art. There is like a decent picture, for instance, of there is the famous, infamous moat house. So to start, then, what I'll try to do is I'll sum up without going into kind of painful detail, the 4 modules, if you like. Let's set aside basically the appendices are fine. The introduction and the interlude will come up as we talk about the modules. But yeah, without going into painful detail, let's just talk about the 4 modules in a big overview, and then talk more generally what works, what doesn't, what's going on in these modules, what might need to change to run them well. T1, very iconic, very popular, really strong Greyhawk feel in a way that, say, B2, also by Gary, doesn't feel like Greyhawk in the same way. It doesn't have this sort of weird granularity of high fantasy. It doesn't have the particular there is an edge to the Gygax stuff in Greyhawk that bleeds over into actually lots of non-Gygax stuff in Greyhawk. There is a feel that you don't get in Forgotten Realms, you don't get in Birthright, which is a pretty standard high fantasy setting in itself. You don't get in the known world, Hollow World, etc. stuff. You don't get in the other high fantasy settings in D&D. And I think that Greyhawk thing is this slightly sort of oddball, high granularity. Is there anything else you can say? Those are the words that are coming to mind. There is a feel. Basically, there's no way to collapse the Great Kingdom or Furiondi or the Horn Society and be like, oh, those could just fit into a region of... they could be near Chicenta, or maybe they could be near Cormyr in the Realms. There's just no way. There is that kind of... in a way that, bluntly, you could probably mix some of those other settings a tiny bit more as to the geography and the feel. And the types of location. Greyhawk has all along, there's enough Conan and enough Favard and the Grey Mouser in them that I think you can just feel the DNA there of something pulpier. But yes, so T1 gets the Greyhawk feel across really well. It is an incredibly granular village module. The joke being basically, you know, he's telling you all the stuff that's in every one of the rooms, of the people who live there. He's giving you all kinds of details you wouldn't necessarily think you need. He's telling you all like their random equipment loadouts. He's giving you maps. There are, in both versions, there are like multiple maps of stuff that you're like, I don't think I need this. Do I? Maybe I do. Like the traders' establishment, the Church of St. Cuthbert, the Inn of the Welcome Wench, the guard tower, as well as the moat house itself. So you get 5 dungeon maps, except there's only 1 dungeon. The maps, by the way, are changed. This is one of the relatively few big changes that you get isometric maps rather than, you can actually see, to be fair, there is like a 2D map there, but you get isometric layouts for those ones, which you don't in the original. The moat house doesn't change. The actual map of Homlet doesn't change really, but the other minor locations get these odd map redesigns. Some of this, that's the thing people offer as a criticism of T1. Some of that is actually quite relevant to the Greyhawk Gygax design philosophy, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But the other part of it is, apart from the stuff you're doing in the village, very detailed village, there's also a really interesting dungeon, much which works in a monster zoo kind of way, but a Gygaxian naturalistic monster zoo. Everything kind of has a story for why it's where it is, and technically works. It's just all like my miniature railway, like my son's miniature railway. We have everything on a really small scale. You know, the village is really close to the town, so the train is only travelling scale-wise about 500 yards to get between places. It's all been compressed. And that has a very famous boss, Lareth the Beautiful, and that is meant to be something that connects you then onto the temple itself, you know, and there is the Temple of Elemental Evil, which has, by the way, an interesting 3rd edition computer adaptation called Temple of Elemental Evil, which I played long before I played D&D, much like I played Baldur's Gate, or Baldur's Gate 2 was what I played. I played those 2 games plenty before I ever played any of the D&D. So that's Temple of Elemental Evil Part 1. It then doesn't come out for ages, obviously the rest, and then what you get is you get lots of intro material, which is meant to kind of make sense of the fact that the second album hasn't been dropped for 6 years. It's meant to make sense of the fact that this is in a wider setting, and that people buying this are buying a whole campaign. This is a big book by standards of the time, you know, 128 pages plus the map booklet, and it's giving you this epic feel, all these stories, how it fits into the world of Greyhawk setting, things you can use from that, the secret history of the temple, players' background, long bits of box text, which I kind of have to assume are Mentzer, and they're generally not, they're not bad, but they're not good. Like most box text, even from this period, it gets too long quickly, and it begins to assume there is a storytelling function totally independent of actually playing Dungeons and Dragons, as if really you'd all just benefit from sitting down and listening to a story told by the DM rather than deciding stuff and having that become the story. One thing to say, you know, losing 3 pages to the interlude, Homlet to Noel, aside from the contents, 3 pages to the intro, that's 6 pages, is that those turn out really for me to be pages lost to the 2 short sections. They're not particularly useful. They're kind of attempting to frame some of the development of the game and the interest of the characters, and it does say, look, these are the factions in the temple, things like that, stuff that is relevant, because the big thing with the temple is that you've got, apart from this being this mini mega dungeon, you also have like loads of factions which you can interact with. They're evil generally, but there's also people you can rescue, blah blah blah, you know, there's loads of stuff going on there. And the high level thing is that Use and Lolth and Zutamoy, so Lolth the goddess of the drow, Zutamoy demon lord of fungus, all have different interests in this, basically this fake temple to elemental evil. And it's not actually to the Elder Elemental Eye, it is ultimately to Zutamoy with Uses assistance. Some of the stuff in the description there doesn't really make sense. I'm not sure what the actual political dynamic is, and I've read it a couple of times. You then get Nolb and the Ruins. Nolb is an evil village, or evil-leaning village, but rougher, readier, out in the forest near the temple. And then you get the upper works of the temple, which are, there's a tower, there's some small building ruins, and then there's the temple itself in the centre of this kind of the ruined upper works, and the temple itself is intact. And that's the upper level of the temple, which goes down. Yeah, so that you're getting a classic upper works module, and you're being given a small location nearby. It's a very small location in terms of actual text. It has some decent encounter stuff, and it has 4 building keys. It's a dramatic opposite to Homlet. You get detail on these 4 buildings, but you don't get anything else. Gary did not write out the buildings there. He didn't. Possibly he just blanked that more. Possibly his players never were there, so there's not in terms of they never did stuff there really. So there wasn't really a key for Mentzer to develop. Part 3, Dungeons of Elemental Evil, is 4 levels, of which the top 2 are the elemental temples of the 4 elements, the 4 western elements: fire, air, earth, water. Dungeon level 3 is 2 sections, one of which is stuff associated with the kind of the true lower temple, the other of which is Zutamoy's prison. She wants to be free, of course, and she has allies in the temple who would like her to be free. And then level 4, which has more of the inner temple stuff, and it also has some stuff to do with the way that Yuz and St. Cuthbert as demigod types can get involved. And then part 4, T4, Nodes of Elemental Evil, is 4 demiplanes, air, earth, fire and water nodes, which are, again, it's slightly unclear. Zutamoy created them to prepare herself and to gain stuff and get power. Sort of, maybe that makes sense. But a key thing for the players is they're going to need to go to all of them to MacGuffin quest to get 4 elemental stones to make a particular item work really well, which will help them deal with Zutamoy if they want to deal with her and destroy her, or rather banish her. And again, that's very short, and you actually are instead getting you're actually just getting a summary key of that and some advice about how to run it. You might already be able to tell what I actually think is comfortably, and this isn't an unpopular opinion, but sometimes I'd probably go in a different way on this to some people, is there's obviously the big problem here is, apart from some forced additions of like, oh well, we need to kind of give them the story of the original table game, and we need to explain this and that, and we need to kind of add all this detail in, that doesn't feel as valuable. The big thing is that 2 of these 4 modules are too short by a long way. Not just are they short, but they are too short and they don't accomplish very much. And the weird thing there is that Homlet is 20 pages with a dungeon, and Nolb is 13 pages with a dungeon, and it doesn't feel like the Nolb section is a third shorter, say. It feels like it's half or less of the length and quality and so on. And I'm not wholly sure why. I think, actually, to be fair, it might be because the way it's laid out is there is like a whole page piece of art. In fact, I think there might be a couple of those in that section in Ruins. Yeah, man, there are like, in that section there are 2 half pages and 1 full page of art in that. And there's barely any art, so you're talking about it's not even 13 pages, it's 11 pages really. Maybe that explains my feeling of it being very short. I should say, with the Nolb section, the upper works, the actual dungeon area, it's not a standalone because there's not much you can do there. You can go and fight some bandits. There's one route into the rest of the dungeon that way. You can clear out some buildings. You can go to the temple and find out how weird stuff is there. That's good. I actually, maybe we'll kind of glance through it in a minute, but that's okay. But Nolb itself is not detailed enough to stand alone with you flicking this open, having read it once, and you're like, okay, great, you go to Nolb. Okay, this is what happens. You're going to yeah, you're going to need to put more work into it. The same with T4, if you want to call it that, Nodes of Elemental Evil, is Mentzer just straight up says at the start, yes, we don't have any space anymore, so you're going to have to do this yourself. I think that's bordering on an outrageous statement. I don't blame Frank Mentzer, really. I mean, not that he'd care if I did, but I think there is something very strange in saying that they may find their way to the nodes because they need this thing, but if they've blundered into the nodes, they will doubtless spend much time there wandering, searching for an exit. Space does not here permit a full description of each small part of the 4 nodes, because even with limited space in use, each of the nodes are more have more area than all 4 dungeon levels. Random and placed encounters are given with other nodes, so the whole is playable as it stands, but a small amount of time, effort and skill on your part can develop the rough notes into fully polished gems of adventure just aching for discovery. He straight up admits it. These are just rough notes, and you're talking about something being waited on for 6 years, and so when you read of people's palpable disappointment with T1-6, I think you can feel it there. You can feel Mentzer's disappointment in the product they're putting out there, that there is something missing. But here's this is the controversial critical edition on that point, is that T1 suffers from this too. T3 doesn't massively. T1 suffers from this too, and always did. This is a great module. This would justify a review on its own, of course, but this is a limited module. There are things, it's evident that players are probably meant to be, PCs are probably meant to be heading into 2nd level by the time they get to the Gatehouse. There is virtually no supporting material here, apart from robbing houses and exposing the traders who are the allies of the Temple of Elemental Evil. That's it. That's the adventure prospects in this module, which is excluding the maps, a 16-page module. This is part of the context. It is itself a shortish module, even for the time. In double column as well, which, though albeit incredibly dense double column. So you've got a dungeon which is slightly high level, which is also implies a level of player skill and engagement above the introductory to novice level. In some ways, I think it's fair to say it's a good. Say you're starting a campaign with some players who have played AD&D particularly before, or old school D&D in general. T1, I think, is realistic there. I think you've got a really tough dungeon at the end that with very little build up and very little skill acquisition beforehand. And of course, it's just your job to add that. Good sources for that. Greyhawk Grognard or Gronyard has his T0 module, which has a couple of other elementally sub-temples, like an equivalent of the Gatehouse but slightly easier. The Princes of the Apocalypse 5th edition module equally has a bunch of ideas to steal. That's an interesting 5th edition book, much like something like Haunted Halls of Evening Star, obviously screwed up by the publisher as much as by anyone. You've got the video game. I straight up just took loads of side quests from that, and I've written also a 1st level Greyhawk dungeon, which I used as a easier intro dungeon, partly for players who'd played less in this campaign that I'm running. So just to add stuff and give players stuff to do, and they may not all level up by the time they go to the Gatehouse, but they'll have learned some of the dynamic of the game. The same with Nulb, of course, is that there's a lot more expansion for Nulb in the video game, and so I just go to that and pick out loads of that. So even T1 though suffers from this issue where, based on what Gary had written up and on what he was willing to put out, because he was like, I've got these details, I can write this easily, this is what I've already prepared, and hey, I'm just going to do a village and a dungeon and we'll put it out. And the fact that it's not quite a complete product in that sense, this is a controversial view on my part, is really predictive of the whole thing. Now here is a defence of that, is that actually, well, it's not a defence, it's an explanation. A reason that you can kind of tell, apart from the actual design, anyone who actually understands dungeon design will read the Gatehouse and realise there are things going on here in terms of the expectations of player ability. This is a war game at this point. Player ability, player literal what characters can do and damage they can output, where this will be an insanely challenging dungeon for a raw first level party who's never played D&D before, out of character. But you can say that there's a thing in T1-4 where it says, okay, there's these giant frogs, famous giant frog encounter. PCs go in, giant frogs attack them from by the Gatehouse and eat a bunch of them. And it says, hey, just change the encounter based on the number of PCs or on the power level of the PCs. And this is 1985. This isn't, and this is Frank Mentzer, a legitimate old school designer, someone who understands D&D. You might say, well, no, it's just the corruption of TSR. We're past the golden age by then. But in fact, we have no reason to not think that Gary didn't sometimes think what players are turning up and what do they expect. What game should we play tonight? In fact, we know he does talk about, you know, the fact that he ran the game in a particular way, which did include control over those designing on the fly sometimes. And so whether or not that's his note, it is a note that makes sense of something going on in T1. And what seems clear to me is this: Gary was a writer who, like, he was gnomic. He was a sage. These books are sometimes koans rather than technical manuals, or rather they are technical manuals full of koans. And I think in the case of T1, he is kind of assuming that the DM, this is the same with B2 by the way, with B2 he just hand waves a bunch of stuff and assumes the DM knows enough about D&D. That's a basic module too. This is how lazy is that he was lazy sometimes. Lazy is the wrong word. How much he was always jumping onto the next thing. He assumes you know, he moves on. Even in the introductory module with Real 1, B2. In this introductory module there is no real hand-holding, and it's assumed you'll know that your characters will be travelling around, random encountering, maybe, or you've rolled a random encounter of bandits, they're in their lair, you've generated they're in their lair, so that's a whole adventure. You draw up their lair. And he'll just assume DMs know that. They'll have read the DMG, right, the whole way through. They'll have understood that crazy book. So yeah, there is an explanation for why T1 is like it is. It is a different explanation for why T2 is like it is. T2, or T1-4, is like that for partly because those are the notes Gary has provided, the same format, and so Mentzer is having to fill out stuff that he realises isn't complete enough. Hence the introduction and the interlude. And hence change a number of small changes like that, saying just bear in mind what players you actually have here. But also because it has to fit into book length, and the book length is 4 times 32, 4 long modules of the time. Except T3 is really it is itself 2 modules really, and that shows up in the page count. It is a 64-page count, 2 modules. And that means that you've lost one of your long modules and you've got to go to whatever mix of, you know, short and long modules you want from there. And what they do, in fact, is, and they've still got to fit in appendices, intro, interlude, so they just split stuff up, narrow it down, squeeze it. Now, what I can say is that Part 3, Dungeons of Elemental Evil, is legitimately a very good dungeon. And I will talk about that in a tiny bit more detail. But yeah, T3, Dungeons of Elemental Evil, is, between whatever contribution comes from Gygax and Mentzer, it is a clever, rambling, fascinating, puzzle-filled, and the puzzle being a Gygax puzzle where you're like, this connects to this. It's not quite the Kunzian depth of, I mean, sometimes it is Kunzian depth of this literally connects to this. It's not quite that, but it is this different Gygaxian puzzle where there's just some kind of high-level Baroque idea in play being worked out over the puzzle. And yeah, the faction play is great. The theming is often great. There's some bit, the grey hawkiness is great. There's some bits that don't quite work, but it's genuinely great. So in one sense, if you want to see this as T1 plus T3 and some notes that someone threw together for T2 and 4, maybe that's legitimate. Really, the ideal thing you want is a T2, which is just Nolb and the surrounding area, and is a 16-page module on its own, maybe, rather than what is in fact it's 5 pages, and Nolb is 5 pages, including like a full-page illustration. So 4 pages. really Nob needs to be a 12, maybe a 12-page module on its own. More like the rough length of Homlet, and it needs to have a surrounding area of stuff, you know, like from the video game. There's a giant Gar here, there's this here, you could go and fight these things. You could go and discover something here or talk to this NPC, rather than the very short summary you get. If you count it as T1 and T3, you have a lot of material here that works really well. It's when you get to the stuff that's crunched, the stuff that is neglected, the stuff you're openly told is rough notes, that you realise that this is a flawed module. So let's assume, you know, I think that I've given really what I see as the biggest set of weaknesses, which is being a bit overwritten and being short and neglected in some areas, but also there's you know, hinted at some of the strengths. You've got loads of detail, you've got loads of ideas, you've got loads of bits connecting, you've got loads of fun stuff to poke and play with. And in the detail, even in the weak sections, there is lots of interesting, fun stuff. So the big thing in the Village of Homlet, I think, is that there is factional play and investigation, but very different to something like N1. N1, a cult has taken over a town. There are good guys and bad guys left. There's weird stuff going on. You don't know what's going on when you get there. Homlet, it's a good town. There are some good NPCs leading it, Bern and Rufus. And there's lots of nice people. There's a nice priest that you can become, a couple of priests you can become friends with. There's a druid who you can become friends with. But there's also some evil traders, and they are allied with the temple. And there's also some evil adventurers in the inn who might be a problem for you, might try to steal stuff from you if they adventure with you. And you also get detail about all of the every single inhabitant, stats for every adult inhabitant, and treasure for every single house. And I don't know, is the treasure too much, or, you know, that feels like a question in itself. I think if you recognise that this bit of Gygax's brain, the bit that wrote T1, thinks that the DM having an exhaustive view of the world, or an ability to generate things exhaustively, is a big part of D&D. And I think that represents the 1E DMG really well, that attitude. I think it represents actually a tradition that stems through a lot of 2nd edition too. And is implied in lots of, not all by any means, but lots of the best special edition material. This exhaustive view of the world the DM has, the DM who is the umpire and referee, you know, who is a controller of the world, who plays the world. And so, of course, there's treasure everywhere. And some players want to know. He knows they want to know. He predicts the Skyrim attitude. Well, if there are people to pickpocket, you might pickpocket them. There are some other things like, why do they all have weapons? This is much clearer, by the way, in terms of why there are so many details on random civilians is much clearer in the original. By the way, there are some interesting layout things, like the way in which treasure in T1 is bolded, whereas in T1-4 it's all in line, basically. But yes, in T1 you have, for instance, typical cottage and imposing stone building with a barrel hanging from chains. This is the home of the local Browmaster, 0 level militiaman, scale mail, shield, spear, mace, 6 hit points, and his wife and young child. And nephew, 0 level militiaman, ring mail, shield, spear, sword, 5 hit points, have recently come to help run the affair. And that doesn't come across as clearly here. You just get it's not presented like that. You just get, oh, this guy lives here and he has this stuff. But there's something in T2 which makes you realise the same thing is going on. Well, I'll tell you in a minute what that is. It's that you get details of the Nob militia. Right at the start of the Nob section, you get a detail of how many people will come out to help do stuff for Nob. And it basically is that there's an expectation that you're going to maybe have battles, mass battles. You need to know, or even if it's not an actual mass combat, and that is very much something that can happen or is assumed to be possible, it is that you are going to potentially be like, I need some militiamen to come with me, and then the DM is going to, because you've convinced Bern and Rufus you need help, or people are attacking you because you've attacked them, and the DM judges a counter raid is in order. You need to know who else can defend the village, and the way it's presented is much more in T1 and in T2 as if you had a wargame scenario in front of you. The revised T1 is much more like most other role-playing scenarios. So in that sense, yeah, the weird additions that maybe jar and don't feel like we wouldn't write them like that now, point to a way that Gary ran the game and expected the game to be, which I think is of value. So I'm all for them. I think given lots of details about, I guess, again, Bern and Rufus's tower, well, the players probably aren't going to storm it, but they might. But anything might happen, and you need to know what is the castle and the city like, or the town like. The same, I guess, with the temple. The inn, well, you might want to sneak around finding out stuff. And the merchants, well, they are bad guys, you might need to break in. So there are reasons for this, but they're not laid out clearly. And they're not even really laid out clearly in this. There's still a lot kind of assumed of, well, I've said that they're the bad guys and the players might come into contact with them, so it makes sense there's a map. There is a 2 and 2, and that's fine. You know, the DM is to be assumed to understand why a map exists. The Gatehouse itself, I think I've already commented on really. It is iconic, it is very hard, it is genuinely tough, and it is Gygaxian naturalism, not straight D&D naturalism. There's the upper works just have loads of stuff near each other. 2 rooms away from them, there's the brigands all hanging out, but then a couple of rooms away there's a huge spider, and a few rooms the other way there's a giant snake. And yeah, I think understanding that this is not meant to feel like a real fortress. That sounds funny because, well, no, it is. Isn't it meant to be like, this is a cool place? This was this D&D fortress I went and cleared out and we had to destroy the monsters. Yes, it is meant to feel like a real D&D place, but not like a real fortress. And that's different to someone very much in the Gygaxian vein, Gene Weigel. That's meant to feel a lot more naturalistic. Here, I think you're just meant to think this is fun. There's cool stuff near each other. There's pretty solid, decent encounter tables, and a sense of things interlocking. That brigands turn up in particular ways and are connected to a particular area. A monster comes out to attack you. It's actually from another area, so if you defeat it, you don't have to fight it again. There's some fun stuff, like a couple of cases through it where you get footsteps or trail, but it's actually the parties. So you get the party starting to freak out over stuff. That's actually them. There's nothing, insanely exciting about that upper level. There is decent treasure throughout. I actually think this is probably underrated for treasure once you understand the conventions of that early Greyhawkian game. The treasure is generally varied enough and interesting enough. The dungeon level is where Lareth the Beautiful, who's a servant to the temple, allied to Lolth, who's kind of allied to Use, who's kind of a rival with Zutamoy, kind of. Lareth has a few recruits who are meant to be sent to the, I think some gnolls and some bugbears who are meant to be going back to the temple. He's got ghouls and zombies, he's got guardsmen, and then he has himself, and he is a level 5 cleric. This is one point. You're imagining a party who's come in at first level, and even if you use insta leveling, gets to second level, and then is fighting this 5th level cleric who is probably with his guards, because it's assumed that, especially because in the barracks chamber there are 12 guards and 2 sergeants. And they connect to the previous one. So you're talking about like 20 guards and a 5th level cleric, and you're talking about a party of 8 to 10 people. Obviously you're meant to be 2nd or 3rd level by the time you get to that final battle, and that fits into the general power level of later modules. So yeah, with that said, Lareth is fun. He he's got good spells to make it an interesting combat. He doesn't have sleep at first level, for instance. He's a cleric, so useful thing about going that route is that he's not colour spraying or sleeping everyone. He'll negotiate. There is an interesting thing about this. Is another thing about you're not fighting him at level 2 to 3. You know, becoming level 3 from killing him, or becoming level 2 from killing him. Is that if you kill him, a 10th level assassin comes to try to kill you. There we are. It's a really interesting. And this is good. It adds the original credits down on the bottom of the T1 module. It's a great module. It's a great dungeon. I think it is not probably the single best dungeon ever to show someone as like, this is how you write a dungeon. It's not bad. If you want to see what's interesting in a dungeon, it's a good example, really. But if you want to give people a sense of, so what you want is a dungeon to be open and accessible to players. They understand why things are going on. They put 2 and 2 together. It's more abstract than that. And it sort of assumes you go around a bunch of weird things. You fight some weird stuff. You sneak through some stuff, avoid some stuff. Then you have a big battle at the end and either negotiate or kill the bad guy. It is very much it's interesting that it is, and this is, I think, much the same here. It is kind of expected that, you know, it really can be a social experience. There is less detail in the original. It says he'll work with them, and he'll be willing to recruit them, and then the assassin is sent. Some of the detail is added here by Mentzer, therefore I don't think we should assume any extra words in T1 are Gary saying that has to be the case. I think some of it is him responding, Mentzer and Pat, with Gary's advice, responding to criticisms and thoughts over time. The revising of the giant frog encounter, comfortably the most surprisingly tough, not necessarily the toughest, but the most surprisingly tough encounter, is probably because they'd heard people complaining about it for 6 years, that they're like I was DMing my brother and his party, and they had like 3 PCs and 2 hirelings, and they all got killed by these giant frogs, and now they don't want to play because they don't get it. They don't get what that was teaching them. Because it's a teachable moment, but it's not a trivially teachable moment. And yeah, they obviously change it for that reason. You then get, in the interlude, you get, my word, you get a page of box text, you get some extra notes, stuff about the setting, including like what happened in the original, and then the background to the temple. And it's kind of fine, too long, get rid of the box text, who cares. Nolb has, to start with, it has a genuinely quite good random encounter set of tables with 3 areas: river, swamp or pond, and forest or scrub. And each of them, they're D12 encounters with a very high chance of an encounter functionally, which is interesting. Yeah, you check 6 times per day on ground, once if the party is travelling by water. And essentially, yeah, you've got like, one is a 7 in 12, one is a 5 in 12, one is an 8 in 12 chance. So very high chances of encounters. That's 6 times a day as well. That feels high. I don't know if that represents an original thing or whatever. Some of it you're fighting temple people, like bugbears, the iconic giant crayfish, who is... there's also crayfish at the moat house. There's the giant crayfish. More giant killer frogs, giant gars in the water. Warships and barge folk, or pirate ships. So one thing is that the barge folk, of course, aren't necessarily evil, are they? They're from Nerdiv, whereas the pirates are and they are officially alignment neutral, evil to chaotic evil. They are associated with Nolb. So there are some social encounters there. Merchant caravan. It might be disguised. They might be disguised as evil pilgrims. Oh no, they might be disguised. Oh, that's funny. So yeah, forest or scrub train, they are disguised evil pilgrims pretending to be merchants. Swamp or pond, it says disguised as evil pilgrims. I just think that's it. I think that's a typo and a hilarious idea. They're merchants who are trying to get through by claiming to be Satanists, basically. stuff about hiring mercenaries and what they'll do and whether they'll betray you, and where you can hire them. Yeah, basically you can get them. They're either evil or they are chaotic neutral. Neutral evil, chaotic evil, or chaotic neutral. Chaotic neutral needn't be the best of those because they are unpredictable and avaricious, we're told. Assistance you might be able to get, well, actually it's that you're told in the, I think it's in the interlude section, you're told you can end up with trainers being, or possibly it's here actually, trainers being sent to Homlet once it's decided that you are the team who's going to go and take out the temple. Trainers get sent to Homlet to help you. Again, the assumption that you're going to be leveling through several levels, obviously. And you're told here, you know, in the Nob section, you can get help here. 2 of the 4 areas that are actually detailed are taverns or hostels. One is actually a hostel run by elemental cultists, but which is basically otherwise normal. And then a tavern and connected tavern and market, which is where the pirates are based out of. And it will tell you, because there's 2 ships, and it'll tell you which ships are in town and stuff like that, and details about what their crews are like. That's great. That's a nice touch. Again, it's wargamey, but it's understanding that there is a thing where you're like, well, the players might want to take out a pirate crew, or it might be they get involved in some kind of problem and they then have to fight off a pirate crew. Then you get the upper works, which has a decent. It's not a first level. It's still kind of, at this point we're talking about a 3rd level dungeon probably. The leader is a level 6 fighter, so it's 3rd level heading into 4th even, but 3rd say. You've got random encounters in the upper works, and then you have this small dungeon, which is technically only 4 rooms, but that's sort of in the context of a wider setting. You know, there's a surrounding area. There are brigands to fight. Then there's some more building ruins with giant rats. Then there is the temple itself, which has, and this is a game relevant illustration of the gates, these antipathy gates, which if you want to free Zutamoy you have to open them all. Why you want to do that, I don't know. Then you have details of the temple. There's not really very much in that upper temple. It's just sort of there. You can get equipment, you can break down doors, you can find various options. You can technically, if you have the special super orb, you can use the elevator. There is, as in it's literally an elevator, so yeah. Is there? Yeah, there's the side set. So there's basically 3 entrances down from here, and I think there's one in the tower as well. So there's lots of ways down. One of which you're gonna have to break open a magical door, so it's less likely. You do that. Then you get the dungeons, and the dungeons basically the top level is it that the top is the Earth Temple, the 2nd you've got the air, fire and water temples, the 3rd, as I say, you've got Zutamoy and some of the inner temple stuff, and then the 4th is the inner temple. And you access the nodes from the 3rd and the 4th levels. And a really good thing going on throughout the dungeons is, even though it's still Gygaxian naturalism at some level, stuff is really close, there's a few things. One, and this is an early iteration of this, for good or bad, there is what you could think of as story XP, that if you rescue good, or any human or demi-human, and some monsters, if they're aligned with you, you gain their XP as XP for you. If you kill them, you lose it. So there's a story XP thing going on there, but it's a much more interesting one than normal. It still assumes motives of the players and requires things of the players that, you know, do they really matter? Will all players, did Sir Robilar worry about doing that when he was raiding it? But yeah, there's also set areas. There's like a knoll base, there's a guard and brigand base. There lower down there's a bugbear base associated with the air temple, which is on the back foot and been losing the rivalry between the temples for a while. And as you go amongst these, you'll find logic therefore to the areas of rooms, and this should remind us of something in modern terms like anomalous subsurface environment is a good example of. It's less strongly themed than that. Maybe it's a bit more like, I don't know, Stonehell or something. This sense, you know, there is a sense that different places are different, and there's constant abilities to interact with stuff in them. Not the ghouls and rats you start with, I'm afraid. As you might imagine, they are harder to interact with, or the gnolls. Basically, alignment and context matter. A lot of that upper level, the front half of the upper level, is a bit tougher to go on. Yeah, there are there's an assumption you might end up speaking or negotiating with the Earth clerics, and not necessarily. But they might do. Their motives are mentioned, and the things they want to do are mentioned, and there are tactics as well for several rooms in a block. There'll be tactics about who goes to help who in combat. So you're kind of assuming that upper level has lots of fighting in it because of the fact it has lots of mindless undead, but it doesn't have to if you are willing to work your way around and negotiate. And then there's an Earth Temple which has basically a puzzle about where you are in the temple, meaning you might be attacked by bound elementals, and you get a bunch of stuff. Some relevant treasure from there, if you dig the right stuff up, one is 800 GP and a potion of diminution. The second chest is 200 PP ringmail +1. Third is 28 brown spinels, each worth 100 GP, so that's 2800, and a morning star +1. And the fourth and last is ring of protection +1, rope of climbing, wand of paralysation with 38 charges, and 3 jars of Kotum's ointment. So yeah, this is Gygaxian treasure, and it feels like it. That means it is detailed. It's not just you find this much treasure, or there's just these coins and a sword +1. But you get a bit of that. You get a bit of like, there's these coins, there's this bit of generic armor, there's this cool item, there's this weird type of gem. There's this very restrained sense of, and self-restraining sense of, this is interesting treasure, but not as rich and fascinating as some of us prefer now. That's stylistically more common. There's a torture chamber that you can interrupt the torture and rescue the guy. At any rate, then you're going down, and you've got 3 temples here, and there's a lot more Red Nails faction play here. You know, there's lots of groups to deal with, and people are desperate for help in some cases, and will negotiate for help against each other. At this point, we are talking about, there's like level 4 cleric, level 5 cleric next to each other. You could still be knocking around here, I think, reasonably with a strong 4th level to 5th level party. You could be on the 2nd level. I think this, if we track it to A and G, you could be finishing this possibly. Does that actually give an official level range? I don't think it does. From 1st level all the way to 8th level and possibly beyond. I think finishing this at 6th or 7th level is perfectly reasonable. Yeah, you start to get magic treasure just knocking around on people. There's a human leader of the Fire Temple forces, has a +1 flame tongue sword. There are some more oddities. There is new monsters, a Drobe Guardian of the Air Temple. There's traps, trap rooms with themed walls with different elemental effects on it, which you might have to go through, and you might have to survive those challenges. And there are ways, because you can, if you get outfits or symbols of the different temples, or the 8-pointed star of the inner temple, these act as MacGuffins to get you through stuff. There's a video gamey feel. That's not a criticism, but there's a video gamey feel, and it would have been video gamey even by about 1985, as you start to get slightly more complex tree games on proto PCs, I guess. But certainly it does now, where there's this kind of like, oh, get this item to bypass this. It also, of course, suits of other things knocking around at the time. You know, choose your own adventure, fighting fantasy. The idea that you inventory something and it becomes a key to something else. And here, and it's the same in WG4, Forgotten Temple of Tharasdan, and other Gygax things. It's a touch he likes, and I can believe that's an original point not added here. You got the famous Canon Belsornig, the leader of the Water Temple, quite powerful level 6 cleric with 2 times hold persons and silence 15-foot radius, which are both very, very painful spells. There is a odd creature that's a pool in the Water Temple, but which can obviously has some kind of special abilities as you deal with stuff. You can find out that it lies to you, it wants you to jump in the pool and help a Triton you think you can see. There are several of these. There's like maybe 4 of these where there's like a good creature imprisoned, but it's not really. Later there's an example of 2 werewolves hiding behind a special mirror who appear to be good priests who are hiding out creating a sanctuary. Here he's doing this, and there's a few other instances of it too. You do get a few examples of inventory rooms, like there's a corridor of bones, I think, on the top level. The Grim Chamber, the cleric of the Air Temple, has his armory there. And the thing is, you're going to want these. I think there's like silver arrows in the bone corridor. In Kelno's Air Temple base, they're bugbear size suits of armor, so not useful to you, but you could sell them to bugbears. But there's also a bastard sword, Morningstar's glaive with arms, and this partly relates to what will Kelno give the bugbears if it really comes to a battle, but it's also we as the party, what can we loot to give to our followers for ourselves. Very, very classic D&D type of thing to do. Got a bugbear base, so much like the themed base up above, really, in that sense. And then you start getting a bit of, I think you get a bit of inner temple stuff right there, with some commanders of the guard. Level 3, it's 2 sections, and there are 2 sections to level 3, which I think you'll be able to see okay there. You can see there's no join between them. One is Zutamoy's, the upper section is Zutamoy's prison, the lower section is just part of the inner temple. Again, you continue to have people you can speak to as you go, you can sneak around, and you should be planning to. If you're a good group doing this, you are not fighting your way room by room down. You're sneaking around, you're setting up combats you can win, you're bypassing powerful opponents who just do not matter. Down there. There's Scorp the Hill Giant, who doesn't really want to fight you necessarily, might just want to hang out and talk to you, potentially. There is actually I feel like it's on level 2, possibly. There is a troll chieftain who 2 trolls from different temples on that big Red Nails level 2 have got to visit them, and they're rivals, but this troll will just help you attack someone. If you're like, we're going to go and attack this temple, he'll be like, yeah, I'm here to do that, sounds good. That's a fun type of like social interaction pillar, isn't it? There's a lab with loads of stuff, which is fun. Sheets of vellum. I think there's an alchemy workroom, with quicksilver, loads of stuff that you can come in and get. And again, you realise the implied game here involves players wanting to go and do the stuff on their own. And again, that's probably originally as much Gary as Mentzer. And the weird list of stuff could well be a Gary thing. The entire key is alchemy workroom, quicksilver worth 1,000 gold. We're now hitting level 7/7 fighter assassin, who I think is she is a half orc. So at this point you're talking about pretty tough leveled creatures. Then you have stuff that leads to Falrinth's base, and Falrinth is not the ultimate boss here, but Falrinth is an 8th level magic user functioning as 9th due to their familiar. 27 HP, so pretty tough as well, especially when you add in spells and any allies they bring in. And is there anything very unpleasant there in terms of, there's no summons, so at least not a summoner. You are relying on lots of good defensive magic and then allies coming from other rooms. And then you have the Prisoner of Zutamoy, which has a bunch of, one thing I quite like is just loads of weird fungi. Chairs made of yellow violet fungi, couches made of green slime. Then there's gemstones. That's cool. Attuned to demons. Maybe not. There's a trap with different stones which you've pressed without doing it properly. Then all kinds of traps come out. Jet of green slime, lightning bolt, blade scything. There's lots going on in there, and the niche, the Zutamoy dungeon has all kinds of crazy powerful stuff. Dane's instant fortress, loads of scrolls, potions, including of invulnerability, superheroism, and rod of smiting with 41 charges. Something for everyone. And then level 4 is a dangerous place even for high level characters, we are told. It doesn't give tactics. You get tactics throughout, but you are told at a few different places, if the players did this in this other area, this will happen. But yeah, down in level 4, you're kind of assuming you need the orb, or it's going to be tough, and you're going to need to help the players get to the orb in terms of get the orb and activate it by getting the elemental node stones. But here, again, you may have Farrant down here. He is sort of a 4th level area, but you might meet him somewhere. There's Ettins and trolls and stuff, much tougher, rougher stuff. The Lord Wizard himself of the temple, 9th level magic user. Again, not running lots of summons, which is interesting and intentional. I think Gary is, because design includes something like balance, even if it's not balance in the sense of a video or board game. And probably having, he has Conjure Elemental at 5, to be fair. But we're not talking about something where you're going to have enemy MUs gating stuff in or dropping in large summons, 3 times in the battle. It is that he will bring in his elemental friend, and he will he will cast invisibility on himself, that sort of thing. More bugbears, ogres, orcs, trolls, Ettins. There's an Ettin who's one of the heads suffers from paranoid delusions, and that's cannot sleep if the other is in the room. It's not quite developed, but there's a few hints of odd conversations you could have with monsters in this one. There is there's hill giants, but one of them is actually not a hill giant. He's polymorphed, replacing Scorp the giant from upstairs, and is a elf druid, or half elf druid, I think, half elf spy, who's a level 9 druid, who, when you come there and have proven your might, will come and help you. So again, there are allies. Some of the prisoners you can free might well join you. Like if they're fighter types, they will come and join you as 0 level men at arms if you're kind to them. You've got a level 9 cleric who's sort of pretty much a Supreme Commander, Hedrak, High Priest, and most honourable Mentzer who use himself. So someone with different interests, of course, to Zutamoy and Lolth, which there are moments of really well developed factional play, but that big level thing between Lareth and Hedrak and the stuff with Zutamoy is never really fully developed. The altar curtain is made of violet fungi in the Greater Temple, and then there are various gates, and interestingly, you often get a thing where you're just told some bugbears are here and you really have to refer back to the basic stat line. Other rooms you get the bugbears stats themselves. Doesn't really matter, but it is an odd inconsistency. And then the nodes, you get that excuse. You get a good use for spell variation rules. Good useful page of that. I approve of these generally. I think going to other planes should feel different, and screwing with spells, not hosing them, not being like, nah, you can't do anything anymore, but just saying, oh, this now works like this, or this doesn't work here, but this works better. That's fun. Players have to adapt. It creates a different meta environment for player skill to emerge in. There is a table of magical treasures. There is a table of random encounters, and the assumption here is that you've got, it's a D100, of which 8 in 10 functionally is no encounter, so it's a 2 in 10 encounter rate, 1 in 5, of which you've got over half of which are set, which are generally fungal, like puddingy types, ascamids, ochre jellies, ficamids, or a wandering human from a selection of wandering humans, or they are a node resident, and the node resident, the lists are below, and you roll on the node resident list per node. There are a few human residents. There are bandits, Dali, 3, 4, 5 or 6. There's 6, yes, 6 human residents, of whom one is good and he wants to join you and help you. One is neutral and he's probably fine with helping you. There's lawful evil guy who doesn't really want to kill you. He'll even make a deal with you and stick to it. There's an Alu demon. There is the old chief cleric of the Air Temple, who's very bitter, and there's a group of bandits who are neutral evil, so they are probably literally easier to negotiate with than others. Yeah, it's not hinted you can. Maybe they're stupid. And then you get this. So yeah, the rough notes is literally, that's keys. It is literally a sentence. A16, large cave at ground level, layer. The north wall is mostly ice. A21, south cave level. A30, layer. Sorry. A30, west cavern ground level. That's what you're getting. You put in layers as you want. There are 2 layers of 4 Heraka Sphinxes, so you put them where you want. The Cloud Giants have a well defendable layer. There are White Dragons, 3 of them, who share a single layer. So you've got quite tough, interesting stuff there that really does feel like you're hitting the right point at level 7 or 8. If you're doing the whole node and orb of death thing, then you're probably getting up to those top levels of 8, maybe even 9 that Gygax suggests on the back. You've got some interesting stuff there. The maps themselves, all the maps throughout have moderate, decent looping and options. Not always to the same degree, but they always have a loop. They always have a couple of points of entrance. So, level 3, you can see the main block. Each subsection of it is looped, sometimes double looped, for instance. And the nodes are similar. They are drawn as dungeons. This is actually one thing that belies the whole, well, who could put detail into this stuff given it's so big? Well, you've only got a set number of places, and you've already mentioned what they are. And you've admitted it's just you're running out of space. But yeah, you've got some like that are ending up in layers. This is the Earth Elemental node. There are lots of dead-end layers, but there is nearly always looping between them, and often a way of bypassing something. It's kind of tough. Some of those are more interesting than others in terms of the examples. The Fire Elemental node is a bit more interesting, and you can meaningfully get scouting and avoidance, which one of the big points I think of looping is to improve and incentivize the skill of exploring and making good decisions about where you go next. It's in terms of the skill development in the game, that's what it's doing. Yeah, you get a bunch of extra monsters here. Misdews, giant ice toads, Ildris Grues, Windwalkers. Then you go to the Earth node. There are Chagrin Grues, Chrismals, Black Dragons, Galabdur, Storopers. Some of these I think are, obviously pretty much new to the module as well. Yeah, I think there's a lot of promise in the node section, and there's always neutral stuff or even okay stuff that maybe you can make friends with. Very rarely are there really good things knocking around. But I mean, say there's to be fair, in the water one there are dragon turtles, water elementals, floating eyes, frost giants, ice lizards, ixochitls, coalents, who are aquatic hobgoblins, aquatic gargoyles, aquatic ghouls, merrow, sea hags, vardigrues, vogenoi, and water weirds. So in fairness, there's sort of water elementals to work with there. Yeah, they're hostile. Really, the wandering humans are meant to give you the way in, aren't they? Where you're like, I could work with this guy. I could work with this guy. And that helps you get out. And you're looking for the stones that take you to a different plane. You realise eventually you need them to put them onto the orb so you don't have to touch them. The orb, which is in the appendix, gives you the powers of like gating in, conjuring relevant elementals, travelling to that plane, being comfortable on that plane. There's a bunch of good at magic items. Leomund's Labile Locker is a command words that make it small, for instance. Pouch of Holding, it's a small bag of holding. Wand of a Wonder, not Wand of Wonder, Wand of a Wonder. You could polymorph yourself into a Mule Centaur accidentally. Monster Summoning 4 effect is if cast by you. The target turns to hot pink. Yeah, fun stuff. Lens of Transformation, Orb of Golden Death, which is a genuinely powerful artifact-like device. So it's a book of missed opportunities. It's something where you've got a couple of those books which, a couple of the sub-modules where you think, oh, okay, is that it? Even the first module to a degree has that. It has a Centerpiece Dungeon which is overwritten, and that overwriting I think sometimes shows up in it. It's not always fascinatingly written either. Mentzer is a very workaday writer, and I think you find that here. But that central dungeon is a very good dungeon. It's very interesting. There's lots of possibilities in it. It requires players to like the idea of a 200-room dungeon. I actually think that's as much of a challenge as anything. Lots of people don't see D&D in that sense as the tentpole dungeon game, and I think T1-4 definitely does assume the game is a dungeon game. Gary himself didn't run the game always like that, and you see by the DMG, the 1E DMG, there is a lot of thought being put into what the C rules because he had to run C combat. And he knows the players wanted eventually to go beyond Castle Greyhawk. They went beyond it and they did lots of other stuff. But if you've got people who are up for, even as an occasional thing, going and beating back the forces of the temple, or maybe going to try to join them or take over them, you've got a lot there in that section, which is the nearest thing we're ever going to get to a Gygax mega dungeon, big dungeon. Nothing else really of his compares in size, and nothing else I think therefore also compares in terms of complexity. The fact that you've got all these different factions, all these different options, these different things you could be going to do. Do you want to go and get the stuff from the nodes? Do you want to free prisoners? Are you looking for allies of the good guys who are hiding in there? Are you trying to create dissension? Are you just trying to destroy stuff without wanting to ally with one faction? Just kill them all. Are you powerful enough to do that? Are you there for loot? Because there is cool loot all over the place. I've given you a few examples, which usually has really not, like interesting but not impossibly hard trap puzzles attached. T1-4 is a really good module. I think it's actually pretty underrated. You get a lot of shade thrown at it because it's obviously incomplete. You get complaints, legitimate ones, about the fact that the way it's incomplete means that you as the DM are putting in work to make basic elements of this module work. Okay, well, you're going to want to get this orb so you can defeat the big monsters on your own. So to do that, you're going to need to get it active and powerful. You need to go and get the stones from the nodes. By the way, we haven't finished the nodes. We don't care. Feel free to do what you like. That is a weakness, and it's not at all unreasonable to say, man, I didn't like that module because of that. I think though that's to limit yourself, because T1, Homlet and the Moat House is justifiably it is a classic, but also T3. The dungeons are the best first edition big dungeon. They're the only one really that hits that scale, I think, pretty much in terms of official TSR products. I'm excluding here Taverns or whatever, I'm talking about just official TSR. It is the best big dungeon, better than Ravenloft, better than Amber, and they are both, I think, much smaller from memory. Maybe Ravenloft approaches it. But yeah, that is what I think. I think it is flawed but underrated. I think it's Greyhawky. I think it's fun. I think it's complex. I think it'll give you a lot of good D&D times. You might disagree. You might agree. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what things you think that you should add. What or did you add when you ran this? Stick those in the comments, because it'll be useful to steal ideas from you. and other people may want to as well. And I guess, what are your other favourite big dungeons for Dungeons and Dragons? And I think let's call that 100 rooms plus. 100 rooms plus for now, or 80 if I'm being generous. Tell me that in the comments too. Till next time.